Thank you, Richard. It's great to be back here at Queen's. There we go. Okay, thanks. This evening, I'd like to address how the broadcast media reacted to the outbreak of sustained political violence here in Northern Ireland in the summer of 1969. And in doing so, I'd like to address three broad issues. I'll consider how the media, especially television, struggled to explain the violence raging in the streets of Londonderry, Derry, and Belfast. I'll address how authorities here tried and failed to control the narrative of events. And I'll also consider how the unrest that summer was presented to foreign audiences, especially those in the United States. Ultimately, the broadcast media upset, discredited, and undermined a unionist establishment that was unprepared for what became an aggressive force, determined to hold authorities accountable. However, I'll argue that while television could highlight the arrogance, ineptitude, and incompetence of government officials, the medium itself was not immune from controversy. In the early days of the Troubles, British television, especially the BBC, failed to offer accurate and informed coverage of seminal events in Irish and British history. But first, a bit of context. And as a historian, I'll go back, right? Back to the 1920s. From the outset, broadcasting in Northern Ireland was strongly influenced by the uneven power structure characterizing life in Northern Ireland. When broadcasting began in the early 1920s, officials in the regional station here proved remarkably differential to the unionist establishment. For instance, when Prime Minister Lord Craigavon asked the BBC to stop reporting results of GAA games prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, Broadcasting House here in Belfast quickly complied. Officials accepted the Prime Minister's complaint that the Sunday broadcasts were, quote, hurting the feelings of the large majority of people in Northern Ireland. Until the appointment of Waldo Maguire in 1953, directors or controllers of the regional BBC service here came from outside of Northern Ireland. On arrival, they were quickly welcomed into the unionist community and schooled in the peculiarities of life in a deeply divided society. From its inception, the regional service defined itself as British, and although it mostly relayed the national program from London, its limited local programming reflected this sense of Britishness. Senior staff in Belfast did not tolerate any reference to divisions within Northern society and insisted that Northern Ireland be presented as an integral part of the United Kingdom. Programs that originated in London that stumbled into the minefield of Irish history or suggested that there were disaffected people here provoked outrage from unionists who prevailed upon London to present the province as British and not as Irish. Although unionists remained sensitive to any perceived slights from broadcasters, some programs in Belfast sought to carefully develop more inclusive Although unionists remained sensitive to any perceived slight from broadcasters, some program makers in Belfast sought to carefully develop more inclusive regional broadcasts in the post-war period. This has been pointed out by Jill McIntosh, who did her PhD here at Queen's University. She demonstrates that Broadcasting House tried to create an Ulster identity that would set Northern Ireland apart from England, Scotland, and Wales, all the while not undermining its Britishness. Talented writers, including Sam Hannibal, W.R. Rogers, and John Hewitt, were recruited to produce material for listeners that would reflect on life in Ulster. However, management remained wary of upsetting the unionist establishment and continued to show a remarkable degree of deference to its political sensibilities. The Belfast station employed few Catholics and featured little cultural programming that could be defined as Gaelic or Irish. The Belfast station embraced a degree of prejudice, self-censorship, and a form of political and cultural bias that characterized the Northern Ireland branch of the United Kingdom's prestigious public broadcasting service. When BBC television arrived, it followed the path that had been established by radio and remained sensitive to the politics of unionism. This deference was certainly what the political establishment expected from the new television service. When the charismatic and somewhat eccentric personality Alan Wicker brought a crew to Belfast in 1959, the first in a series of programs about life in the region was denounced by the unionist government at Stormont as insulting. Wicker had highlighted the fact that there were many pubs, betting shops, and armed policemen in Belfast, and that sectarian graffiti graced the city's walls. London responded to the howls of protest from Stormont by cancelling the remaining programs Wicker had planned. At Broadcasting House in Belfast, the controller, Waldo Maguire, went on the air to apologize to the people of Northern Ireland for a program that he also found offensive, telling viewers that he had not been consulted by Wicker or his team. London promised officials at Broadcasting House in Belfast that in the future they would be consulted about any and all programs concerning Northern Ireland, or for that matter, Ireland. Wicker and many of his colleagues in London were appalled by the reaction of their superiors in London, who they argued had caved into a hysterical overreaction from primitives in Belfast. Many in the BBC in London came to regard Northern Ireland as a bizarre backwater, and the regional service as what one editor described the Siberia of the BBC. Until 1968, program makers from London ignored the region and avoided coming back. In these circumstances, the regional station based at Broadcasting House existed in a veritable cocoon and failed to embrace the strong public service ethos that defined the national service. Given its success at banishing the likes of Alan Wicker and gaining a commitment that Belfast would be consulted about any and all programs made about any part of Ireland, the unionist establishment expected the BBC to behave and not intrude into its affairs. It was expected that the BBC would not cause trouble, but would accept what one official referred to as the, quote, special circumstances that characterized life in the region. Of course, the BBC was not the only game in town. In 1959, the Henderson family, owners of the staunchly unionist Belfast newsletter, acquired the independent franchise to open a commercial service, Ulster Television, or UTV. The Hendersons regarded this enterprise as an investment and operated the franchise as a money-making commercial service that would entertain viewers. The chairman of UTV was Brum Henderson. He was a former Stormont MP who had served as chairman of the Ulster Unionist Council. In these circumstances, the chance of any programs being aired in Northern Ireland by UTV that might upset the political status quo were exceedingly slim. Unionist domination of the broadcast media in the region began to erode in 1968 when the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association began a series of protest marches. In the autumn of 1968, one particular event famously gained the civil rights campaign both international attention and sympathy, while undermining the credibility of the Northern Ireland government. On October 5th of 1968, the Derry Housing Action Committee, along with the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, organized a march in Derry, ignoring a ban issued by the Minister of Home Affairs, William Craig. As is widely known, the Royal Ulster Constabulary attacked the demonstrators, viciously beating helpless protesters with batons. Eddie McIntyre, Jerry Fitt, and 3 Labour MPs who had traveled from Britain for the march experienced the police violence firsthand. A bloodied Fitt had to be transported to a Derry hospital via ambulance for medical treatment. What made the event extraordinary was the fact that cameraman Gay O'Brien and sound technician Eamon Hayes from Ireland's national television service, RTE, captured the police violence on film. These are a couple of screenshots from the film itself. This sensational footage made its way onto the BBC program 24 Hours. And from there, as we would say, it went viral. It was picked up by news organizations around the world, causing uproar. Immediately after the incident, the Stormont government issued a resolute statement, quote, supporting in a firm way the decision of the minister, William Craig, and the actions of the police in Londonderry. Images of truncheon-wielding policemen beating unarmed civil rights marchers made a mockery of Stormont's defiant statement. In London, the British government grew increasingly concerned with events in Northern Ireland and was acutely embarrassed at the media attention the October event garnered. A week after the Derry melee, Northern Ireland Prime Minister Terence O'Neill addressed these events in a cabinet meeting, arguing that disorder in the streets threatened the stability of the province and the viability of his government. According to O'Neill, the unflattering publicity from Derry meant left-wing sources were exerting increased pressure on British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, pressure to intervene more aggressively to demand reforms. O'Neill told his colleagues, quote, up to now he, that's Wilson, had fobbed off these pressures from our point of view very well. With his many other headaches, our affairs have not been high up on his agenda. With Northern Ireland calm and a general feeling that slow but steady progress was underway, he could contain the situation by references to our talks, though not without a veiled threat on occasion. I would be failing in my duty if I did not make it clear to you that, in my view, Londonderry has dramatically altered the situation to our great disadvantage. Whether the press and TV coverage was fair is immaterial. We have now become the focus of world opinion. Indeed, we know through official channels that the embassy and the British Information Service in America have been under intense pressure from the American press. O'Neill emphasized that the events in Derry were transformative, not because of the actions of the RUC, but because they were filmed and transmitted around the world. He pleaded with his cabinet to understand the reality of the situation, arguing that reforms had to be introduced and implemented quickly. O'Neill told his colleagues that he expected to be summoned to London to meet with Wilson, and that it was imperative that he be able to promise the British Prime Minister that Stormont was committed to substantial reforms and that these reforms would be implemented quickly. He acknowledged how hard it would be for unionists to push forward reforms in the aftermath of the disturbances in Derry, but again stressed that difficult choices had to be made. And again, a photograph here of O'Neill and Wilson. When O'Neill traveled to London to meet with Wilson, Wilson asked him about the reforms. He received a promise that they would in fact go forward. And Wilson asked him about the disorder in Derry, saying that he had seen the television footage. O'Neill's response was that, well, the footage had been done by RTE, as if that somehow changed the situation. Under pressure from London, and as tension ran high throughout the province, a beleaguered O'Neill announced a set of sweeping reforms on November 22nd, 1968, designed to mollify both the British Prime Minister and leaders of the Civil Rights Campaign. These reforms infuriated hardliners inside and outside the Unionist Party, who schemed to undermine O'Neill and depose him as Prime Minister. Under intense pressure, O'Neill decided to address Northern Ireland on television that December. His Ulster at the Crossroads appeal told civil writers, quote, your voice has been heard and clearly heard. Your duty now is to take the heat out of the situation. He also denounced as lunacy those who advocated an independent Ulster. At Broadcasting House in Belfast, the controller of the BBC Northern Ireland, Waldo Maguire, who was a cautious supporter of O'Neill, reported to colleagues that the, quote, the public reaction to the speech was dramatic. Our telephone switchboard was inundated for hours, almost all the call praising Captain O'Neill's broadcast. To coincide with these reforms, the BBC here in Northern Ireland produced two special reports that explained the government initiatives. Winds of Change was broadcast on the evening that O'Neill's reforms were announced, and another program, Ulster at the Crossroads, followed the Prime Minister's December 9th speech. Initially, O'Neill's appeal seemed to succeed. Relative calm returned to the province for the month of December, and he gained enough support to dismiss the uncompromising William Craig from his cabinet. It was perhaps the only time a unionist government at Stormont had been proactive and successfully exploited the medium of television. One could argue it would be the last. Although many in the civil rights movement heeded O'Neill's call to give his reform a chance, People's Democracy was not impressed. On New Year's Day 1969, its members, most of whom were young students from Queen's University, embarked on a contentious march from Belfast to Derry. I want to show a quick clip here.
Kind of Ulster do you want?
This is O'Neill.
A happy and respected province in good standing with the rest of the United Kingdom, or a place continually torn apart by riots and demonstrations and regarded by the rest of Britain as a political outcast? As always in a democracy, the choice is yours. I will accept whatever your verdict may be. If it is your decision that we should live up to the words Ulster is British, which is part of our creed, then my services will be at your disposal to do what I can. But if you should want a separate, inward-looking, selfish and divided Ulster, then you must seek for others to lead you along that road, for I cannot and will not do it.
Reforming Unionist Prime Minister Terence O'Neill's desperate attempt to stem the growing tide of chaos. His appeal fell on deaf ears.
This is Terence O'Neill leaving Broadcasting House after his speech. If any of you have seen Terence O'Neill, he's usually very measured. I mean, that's as emotional as you'll ever see him on film. And this is O'Neill leaving Broadcasting House with Waldo Maguire there to his right. The photograph has been taken by Victor Patterson, who has done some wonderful work photographing many of these events. And again, to come back to New Year's Day, 1969, of course, People's Democracy embarks on a contentious march from Belfast to Derry. And once again, television would play a critical role in documenting events, capturing a vicious attack on marchers by loyalists, including off-duty B specials, who launched an ambush, of course, at Burntallet Bridge. Again, television images of these disturbances found an international audience, and as historian Jonathan Barden argues, quote, vividly recorded history in the making, vying with reports about the Vietnam War and playing its part in giving Northern Ireland a sharp push towards the precipice. The young leaders of People's Democracy understood the power of television and were keen to exploit it. Bernadette Devlin, who was elected to Westminster in April 1969, became what historian Joe Lee describes as, quote, a media star and an accomplished public performer. When asked about the presence of cameras filming these events, she told one interviewer, quote, in retrospect, I realized the police had actually done us a great favor. In an effort to gain a mandate for the reforms he initiated, O'Neill called an election in February of 1969. However, the support he hoped for proved elusive, and confronted with this reality, he resigned in April. The print and broadcast media covered his resignation extensively, along with the narrow election of his successor, James Chichester Clark. O'Neill's resignation speech carried on television was defensive. He presented himself as an enlightened leader, undermined by a primitive people, motivated by uncompromising prejudice. O'Neill scolded his audience, noting that a few weeks earlier he had called an election, quote, to afford you the chance to break the mold of sectarian politics for once and for all. In many places, old fears, old prejudices, and old loyalties were simply too strong. As O'Neill chastised voters on the way out of office, viewers watched news reports announcing their new Prime Minister, James Chichester Clark. James Chichester Clark was presented to viewers under glaring television lights on the steps of the Great Hall at Stormont, blinking and smiling awkwardly for the cameras while shifting nervously from one foot to the other. During the war, Chichester Clark had served with distinction as an officer in the predominantly Catholic Irish Guards. He saw action in North Africa and in Italy and was badly wounded at Anzio. He was elected unopposed to what was essentially a family seat in 1960, and until 1969 enjoyed an uneventful political career. Although he had opposed the timing of the granting of universal suffrage in local elections, he was seen in London as a liberal unionist and understood to be appalled by the sectarianism that characterized elements of popular loyalism. When he made his TV debut as Prime Minister, it was plain to see he was painfully uncomfortable before cameras, and this became more pronounced as his abbreviated tenure unfolded. In London, Harold Wilson became increasingly apprehensive, fearing that continued unrest in the streets of Northern Ireland would require the deployment of the British Army and the imposition of direct rule. He was determined to prevent this from happening. Shortly after O'Neill's resignation, the Home Secretary, James Callaghan, prepared a detailed memorandum for the Cabinet, providing an overview of the political situation. Callaghan's document was an attempt to educate a government about developments in a part of the United Kingdom that the ministers knew little about. He emphasized that the cardinal aim of British policy should be to let Northern Ireland solve its own problems, reminding colleagues that the Stormont Parliament represented the wishes of the Protestant majority, who had adamantly opposed the imposition of direct rule. The Home Secretary tried bravely to put a positive spin on the crisis, maintaining that because the Labour government had put pressure on Northern Ireland, long overdue reforms were underway. He also emphasized, quote, the presence of television cameras and reporters in Northern Ireland has made a substantial impact there. A British cabinet minister claiming that television was making a positive contribution to resolving the conflict was extraordinary. It wouldn't be repeated. In the near future, governments would define the broadcast media as providing aid and comfort to the enemy, who are responsible for the violence bedeviling the province. Looking ahead, Callaghan warned his colleagues that the upcoming Apprentice Boy Parade in Londonderry could spark serious trouble. He reported that 4 times as many people as normal were expected to take part in the August parade, and there was a prospect of what he termed, quote, severe disorder. He received permission to make helicopters and tear gas available to the Northern Ireland authorities, explaining that London was dependent on the RUC to keep the peace and prevent the deployment of the army. As predicted, on August 12th, ferocious rioting broke out in Derry and quickly spread to Belfast. During the nights of August 14th and August 15th, Belfast witnessed frightening levels of violence. 7 people were killed and scores of homes burned as angry gangs terrorized inner city neighborhoods. During 2 nights of mayhem, 745 people were injured, and 154 of those with gunshot wounds, and close to 1,800 people were forced from their homes. Confused television images were broadcast into homes throughout the United Kingdom, Ireland, and much of the world, highlighting the city's descent into near anarchy. Film of terrified children, along with elderly men and women fleeing burned out homes, was transmitted internationally, as were reports that members of the security forces either stood by and did nothing or actually helped direct the mayhem. As violence escalated, Chichester Clark mobilized the Ulster Special Constabulary, or B Specials, who were despised by Catholics and regarded as overtly sectarian vigilantes. At Stormont, Chichester Clark's Minister for Home Affairs told the Cabinet that the B Specials would, quote, guard threatened Roman Catholic homes in Protestant areas, with Protestant houses in Roman Catholic areas being protected by the RUC. This he argued, would help relieve regular police and demonstrate that the USC existed to help preserve law and order in the interests of all sections of the community. The mobilizing of the B specials and their placement near Catholic homes in Protestant areas was not seen as a gesture of goodwill by the minority community, but rather a deliberate provocation meant to intimidate Catholics. In the middle of this violence, Chichester Clark appeared on television and on radio to warn that all necessary force would be used to restore order, but added, quote, "We want peace, not vengeance. If the rioters withdraw peacefully to their homes and observe the law, no attempt will be made to exploit the situation." His plea was ignored and violence continued unabated. By August 14, 1969, the Wilson government was forced to send in the army, doing something that it was loath to do. Television cameras filmed the arrival of anxious soldiers in full battle gear in streets still smoldering from the previous night's rioting. Television cameras also captured the warm reception troops received in Catholic neighborhoods of Belfast, where women brought tea and sandwiches to welcome the soldiers and the protection they offered their besieged communities. The commander at land forces in the province, General Sir Ian Friedland, appeared on national television networks to offer a prophetic warning. Quote, "The honeymoon period cannot last forever. Obviously, we're perhaps at our peak now, everybody smiling and swapping cups of tea, but unless there is a solution or some hope for the future, and this is where the politicians have to come in, the soldiers are not going to be welcomed on the streets forever." A short time later, the Stormont cabinet met to review the security situation. Ministers expressed outrage at the manner in which events had been portrayed in the media, especially on television. Cabinet minutes document the frustration of a government unable to comprehend, never mind control, an unfolding narrative that portrayed the province and its government in a highly unflattering manner. In these circumstances, the cabinet urged the Prime Minister to hold a press conference to set the record straight. Chichester Clark agreed and quickly arranged a televised press conference at Stormont Castle. The event proved an unmitigated debacle. A senior aide to the Prime Minister, Kenneth Bloomfield, recalled watching in horrified embarrassment for the back of a crowded room as the inarticulate Prime Minister and his Minister of Home Affairs, Robert Porter, struggled to explain events and answer tough, direct questions from an aggressive group of veteran journalists. Bloomfield described the scene that unfolded, quote, "The compact room, conveying somehow the atmosphere of a show trial, was packed with eminent correspondents from Rome and Dublin, Frankfurt and Paris, New York and Los Angeles. Neither Chichester Clark nor Porter had the slightest intention to deceive or mislead. The trouble was that they had not been present on the disorderly and frightening streets of Belfast, and many of these working journalists had. So it was that many of the politicians' explanations and replies were treated with skepticism bordering on derision." The televised news conference made it clear that Chichester Clark and Porter were badly misinformed, confused, and simply incapable of answering journalists who had witnessed firsthand the violence that had engulfed both Belfast and Derry. Chichester Clark blamed the IRA for the violence, while a belligerent Brian Faulkner interrupted his Prime Minister to insist that Catholic areas of Belfast suffered the most because, quote, "armed men who have arms are using those arms. That is why there is trouble in those areas. That is where the firing came from." Relations between Belfast and Dublin were already frayed, but deteriorated sharply when, in the midst of the turmoil, the Taoiseach Jack Lynch took to the airwaves in Dublin to appeal for United Nations intervention and to warn that Dublin, quote, "could not stand by while the violence continued." Chichester Clark used the Stormont Castle press conference to disparage Lynch and forcefully denounced the Irish government's criticism. In Dublin, the British ambassador watched the televised press conference live and was appalled at the abusive comments and demeanor of the Northern Ireland Prime Minister. He quickly forwarded a cable to London, defining Chichester Clark's remark as, quote, not only depressing, but dangerous. Ambassador Andrew Gilchrist believed the B specials had been responsible for much of the violence that had taken place in Belfast, and was dismayed that Chichester Clark had defiantly defended the force, and even gone so far as to suggest that London had actually wanted the B specials deployed. He told the Foreign Office that Chichester Clark's televised comments were, quote, reckless and irresponsible. According to the British ambassador, the Irish government had done, quote, a number of foolish and irritating and provocative things, and public opinion was bewildered by the popularity of the British troops among the Northern Catholics. He described Jack Lynch's televised speech as, quote, that of a shaken man, and described the highly charged and emotional feelings prevailing in Ireland. In these circumstances, he believed that Chichester Clark's televised press conference was dangerously provocative because, quote, he let fly at Lynch with words like clumsy, comic, inept, squalid, and ends by comparing the Irish government to hooligans. Gilchrist argued that this attack on Lynch stoked anger against the authorities in Northern Ireland and rallied the Irish people behind their leader. The ambassador was convinced Chichester Clark was not simply guilty of a diplomatic indiscretion, but was using language which, quote, is liable to lead not merely to loss of life and disorder, but to the employment of unforeseeable numbers of British troops in guerrilla war. And of course, the photographs say everything. The expression on the soldier's face, it shows a sense of bewilderment. I want to show a quick clip of that press conference with Chichester Clark.
The real cause of the disorder is to be found in the activities of extreme Republican elements and others determined to overthrow our state. That is why we have found it necessary to detain a considerable number of known and dangerous agitators. The Chief of Staff of the IRA has admitted that his organization, quote, has been giving leadership, helping with stones, petrol bombs, and mark the words, other traditional methods of defense. I must say that attempting to set people and property on fire hardly strikes me as a defensive technique. And I would remind you again that the trouble in Belfast began with firing upon the police at widely scattered locations within a short period of time. We have, too, open attempts to recruit Republican forces in the South for intervention here. In this grave situation, the behavior of the Dublin government has been deplorable, and it has been tailor-made to inflame opinion on both sides. The moving of army units, calling up of reserves, the absurd approaches for United Nations intervention have all been moves of almost incredible clumsiness and ineptitude. I am glad to say that Dr. Hillary returned to his department in Dublin from his visit to the Foreign Office after what he himself described as a polite but very firm brush off.
It's a question about damage in West Belfast.
Well, this may well be. I'm not in a position to say yet, because quite frankly, it hasn't been feasible for many people to go into those areas, as you know, and it will obviously take a very long time to make a count and assessment of all the dreadful things that have happened.
The tragic situation is that there are people, unfortunately, living in the Catholic areas who are no more representative of the Catholic community at large than the man in the moon, and who have arms and have been using those arms. That is why the trouble is in those areas. That is where the firing came.
Harold Wilson met his cabinet colleagues to discuss the crisis at Downing Street on the morning of August 19th. He was scheduled to meet with Chichester Clark later that day. When considering the origins of the disorder, his Home Secretary, James Callaghan, reported, quote, "There was a good deal of corroboration for the view that Catholics had acted largely in self-defense, and there was little evidence to support the view of the Northern Ireland government that the Irish Republican Army was mainly responsible. But there was no doubt that the dominant feeling in Northern Ireland was fear. Having failed to prevent the deployment of the army, the Wilson government had a new priority, a determination to avoid imposing direct rule for fear it could provoke a violent backlash from angry Protestants, drawing London even deeper into the Irish crisis. The cabinet was told a joint press conference would be held where the two prime ministers would reiterate a commitment to reform while underlining the commitment to the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. James Chichester Clark arrived at Downing Street accompanied by two of his cabinet colleagues, Brian Faulkner and Robert Porter. Although the meeting reaffirmed London's constitutional pledge to Northern Ireland, a communique was issued that implicitly criticized the Stormont government. What was described as the Downing Street Declaration underlined the need for all citizens of the province to be treated equally and enjoy freedom from discrimination, regardless of their religion or political affiliation. As arranged, after the meeting, the British Prime Minister and his Northern Irish counterpart held a joint press conference that was televised throughout the United Kingdom, and parts of it were rebroadcast around much of the world. Much to the consternation of the Northern Ireland delegation, Wilson abruptly informed viewers that the Ulster Special Constabulary would be dissolved. On screen, James Chichester Clark came across once again as bewildered and somewhat confused. Brian Faulkner recalled these events in his memoirs, insisting that during the meetings in Downing Street there had been, quote, "no suggestion whatsoever that the specials should be disbanded." He remembered watching the televised press conference that featured Wilson and Chichester Clark and being horrified when the British Prime Minister announced that these specials would be phased out. Back in Northern Ireland, Unionists watched the press conference and their Prime Minister's unsettling performance at Downing Street with growing concern. Robert Ramsay, a senior member of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, who accompanied the delegation to London, described what he defined as the woeful scene that took place outside of the Prime Minister's residence. Ramsay claimed that television portrayed Chichester Clark and his colleagues, quote, standing outside number 10, being bombarded by hostile press questions, giving the impression of wayward schoolboys outside a headmaster's study after a severe wigging. Protocol demanded that Chichester Clark took the lead in responding to the questions, and his performance did not even live up to his own low standards. And again, that was Robert Ramsay. In an age when comfort and control in front of television cameras was essential to any politician's success, James Chichester Clark's faltering performance unnerved his supporters. His now frequent appearances on television were not reassuring. He read statements in monotone from a prepared script with a contorted expression suggesting he was unsure what the next sentence might say. The unforgiving glare of television lights magnified this awkward demeanor. On television, the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland looked like a man desperately searching for the nearest exit, anxious to flee floodlights and difficult questions. For an audience concerned about a fractured community sliding into the abyss, the image of this harried, overwhelmed aristocrat was hardly reassuring. When the Unionist delegation returned to Belfast, a combative Brian Faulkner tried to salvage the London debacle. He held an abrupt, disjointed, and ultimately unconvincing television news conference on behalf of the Stormont government. Faulkner flatly denied that the B specials were being disbanded, telling viewers, quote, "There is absolutely no suggestion that the Ulster Special Constabulary should be disbanded. Let me make this crystal clear." The news conference that Faulkner gave only compounded the difficulties of the Stormont government, illustrating its impotence to viewers throughout the United Kingdom. The reality was that the Special Constabulary was on its way out. Hardline loyalist critics reacted to these events by lambasting the government as incompetent and treacherous. Faulkner later recalled again in his memoirs that, quote, "the damage had been done, and it was easy for Craig and Paisley to represent my statements as dishonest and a cover-up of doing the dirty on the specials. The official disbanding of the Ulster Special Constabulary, or B Specials, was left to the Hunt Report, which endorsed its demise in October of 1971. It was not only the unionist political establishment that seemed confused and disorientated by events of August 1969. What many regarded as the world's leading public service broadcaster, the BBC, came in for heavy criticism for censoring news of these events. The print media covered the Battle of the Bogside and the outbreak of violence in Belfast closely. Journalists from a number of national and international publications were in Northern Ireland and filed stories with their newspapers detailing the unrest that convulsed the province. However, the BBC transmitted images that it later admitted were carefully, quote, sanitized, censoring coverage of these seminal events. Although viewers saw images of burning buildings and fleeing refugees, no comprehensive description of the unrest was allowed. Interviews and analysis that might explain the crisis to anxious viewers were not allowed. It was feared that emotional outbursts or inflammatory accusations might create more violence. The decision to censor coverage of the unrest proved controversial. The Times, the Daily Mirror, and the Observer all featured articles heavily critical of the BBC's handling of the crisis. Most argued that the UK's public broadcasting service was exceedingly cautious in its coverage. The Times arguing that it was guilty of, quote, an excessive sense of responsibility in fear of inflaming local passions. Perhaps the most influential voice at the BBC in deciding how these events would be addressed was the Belfast controller, Waldo Maguire. Maguire wielded significant influence deciding what should and should not be broadcast on both the national and local network. When confronted by criticism, Maguire was defensive, even combative. He explained that beginning on the 12th of August, the anarchy that threatened Belfast and Derry, at this time senior broadcasting officials gathered in London to decide how news of these events should be disseminated. Maguire's advice influenced critical decisions made by senior staff in London, including John Crowley, the editor of News and Current Affairs, and Oliver Whiteley, who stood in for the Director General, Charles Curran, who was out of the country. According to the controller, a decision was made that coverage would be handled carefully and done clinically, quote, in a way which would not worsen the situation. When pressed on these issues, he argued that when the violence broke out, the BBC had two options. It could treat Northern Ireland as a foreign country and produce, quote, the same kind of uninhibited programs which would be made if the shooting, rioting, looting, and arson were taking place in a foreign country, and then ensure that it was not carried on Northern Ireland transmitters. Or it could modify, to some extent, the presentation of news in a way designed to avoid extreme provocation. The BBC chose the latter option, refusing to fully inform viewers throughout the United Kingdom of what was taking place in Northern Ireland. Interviews with leading activists, including Bernadette Devlin and Ian Paisley, were forbidden. Maguire remained defiantly unapologetic and rejected accusations of censorship. He complained, quote, critics say the BBC should have said clearly who started the trouble and who carried it on. The plain fact is that the BBC did not know and does not know. Our reporters report what they see and hear, and neither of our reporters in Belfast at the time knew more than they broadcast. What we did do was report faithfully the claims and counterclaims made by the two sides. The controller's claim that the BBC did not know the details of the rioting did not stand up to scrutiny. The veteran BBC correspondent Martin Bell, who was in Belfast and spent many years covering the conflict, would later recall, quote, we made a mistake in 1969, in August of that year, when Catholics were burned out of their homes in the Falls by Protestants who attacked them from the Shankill. The BBC reports then gave no indication of who the refugees were. They just spoke of refugees. The public was not to know whether they were Catholic or Protestant or who was attacking whom. This has been seen as a grave mistake. Bell maintained that staff in Broadcasting House Belfast knew what was taking place and who was responsible. BBC News and Current Affairs enjoyed a reputation for excellence, but on this occasion, many would argue that the BBC failed in its mission as a public service. Across the Atlantic, the three main American television networks covered Northern Ireland's descent into the Troubles extensively. The three networks were CBS, NBC, and ABC, and they were hugely influential sources of news and information. Their nightly newscasts attracted millions of viewers. And this is a TV guide advertising the Anchormen in 1968, leading up to the convention in Chicago. By the summer of 1969, American viewers had seen footage of black civil rights marchers being assaulted by menacing policemen in places such as Mississippi and Alabama. Americans had also watched television coverage of the ferocious rioting that scarred cities across the United States in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King. For American audiences, the images of refugees fleeing burned out streets while heavily armed soldiers looked on were depressingly familiar. In evening news broadcasts, Americans were also witnessing extensive reporting of a very unpopular war in Vietnam and the turbulent anti-war protesters taking place in the streets. Much to the consternation of British officials in London, Washington, and New York, the mainstream American press inevitably compared the unrest in Northern Ireland to these events. That August, after presenting the evening news that included a report from Belfast, one of these iconic anchormen, Chet Huntley, closed the evening's national broadcast with an editorial drawing this parallel for his audiences. Quote, "The Catholics in Ulster are the same as the blacks in the United States. They've been deprived of their rights, harried into slums and denied jobs, hurt and slashed, and like the blacks, they've revolted. And like the blacks, they've burned down the very ghettos that were built to contain them. And like the blacks, they've been shot down." In the summer of 1969, American news reports compared the Unionists who dominated Northern Ireland to Southern segregationists and the Orange Order to the Ku Klux Klan. These simplistic comparisons resonated not only in the Irish diaspora, but with progressive supporters of the Democratic Party who supported civil rights both at home and abroad. These reports were a cause of tremendous consternation and embarrassment for British governments that understood the broadcasts undermined the image of the United Kingdom that it was keen to promote, that of a dynamic, democratic, and progressive force in the free world. And again, these are the anchormen. Walter Cronkite on the lower left, Huntley and Brinkley standing up top, and who is this last one? I'll remember him. Howard Smith, I think. And here, Huntley and Brinkley, again, sort of iconic anchormen. And I talked to my students about how important the network news was in the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1980s. There's no social media. People read newspapers, but the news, especially this network news that would be broadcast every evening at 6 o'clock or 6:30, this would be tremendously important and influential. Again, the comparisons were inevitable, right? Americans were used to seeing this sort of African American movement for civil rights. The marches taking place, such as this March on Washington. That's Martin Luther King, at the very bottom, the third from the left. And again, the comparisons between what was going on in the American South and Northern Ireland were inevitable. The attacks on civil rights marches in Birmingham and then in Derry. The troops, patrolling streets in Washington, D.C. in the aftermath of ferocious rioting after the King assassination. And again, soldiers in Belfast. And again, America watching 1969 at home. Television is an incredibly powerful medium. Up until the outbreak of the Troubles, one could argue that the BBC was not an objective public service broadcaster when it came to Northern Ireland, as it remained incredibly deferential to the Unionist establishment. This began to change in the aftermath of 1969. At Broadcasting House in Belfast, Waldo Maguire, who served as controller when the violence erupted, had defended censorship and urged caution when reporting these events. His advice was not appreciated by many younger, more aggressive journalists who arrived after August 1969, anxious to ask awkward questions about a dysfunctional state. And his advice was not appreciated by many who were working in the BBC and Broadcasting House in 1969, people such as Martin Bell. Within the BBC, a number of managers, editors, and journalists emerged as courageous public servants, committed to providing informed news of events as the violence escalated. In Belfast, they challenged and changed the passive culture that had characterized the region's news and current affairs programming. BBC reporting of the Troubles became more objective and critical of government policy, and this caused tremendous unease at Stormont. In London, Labour and Conservative governments alike would grow increasingly concerned with the violence, but also with the damage that television reports were causing. As violence escalated, reporting would unnerve governments by questioning the policies, tactics, and decisions of those in authority. Civil, political, and military leaders reacted with fury to reports that maintained heavy-handed British policies were alienating the Catholic community and encouraging the minority to support the IRA. Eventually, reporting by broadcasters that the Thatcher government, defined as aiding and abetting subversives, provoked the imposition of formal censorship by authorities determined to influence or control the narrative events playing out over a sustained period of deadly conflict. When violence broke out in 1969, unionists at Stormont were bewildered by events that were moving very quickly. The last three prime ministers, Terence O'Neill, James Chichester Clark, and Brian Faulkner, all felt misunderstood and even betrayed by both the British government as well as the British broadcast media. While they struggled to take advantage of the power of television, many of their adversaries, including Bernadette Devlin, John Hume, and of course Ian Paisley, did not. Instead, their adversaries succeeded in using the medium to reach audiences both at home in Northern Ireland and abroad. In 1969, the broadcast media began to grapple with the challenges inherent in reporting about the complexity of the Troubles. Not unlike the Parliament at Westminster before the outbreak of violence, broadcasters in London had left Northern Ireland to its own devices. Therefore, BBC and independent television companies were confronted with a steep learning curve in 1969 when trying to catch up and get a grasp of events. The same would prove true for the British government. Over the next 30 years, the broadcast media, especially television, played an integral role in the continuing crisis, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in events. News reports and current affairs programming oftentimes provoked controversy and became news in itself. In spite of engaging in self-censorship and then being exposed to government threats and bullying, and finally being subject to formal censorship, the broadcast media proved a critical force in explaining events to a regional, national, and international audience. Television especially highlighted the barbarity of the conflict, the seemingly relentless killings, bombings, and shootings that played out over 3 decades. Television also played a critical role in holding authorities accountable for policies that were oftentimes misguided, counterproductive, immoral, or outright illegal. Indeed, one could argue that lessons would be learned by and about the broadcast media, especially the hugely influential BBC. Many would come to appreciate that the existence of public service media, driven by a professional sense of the responsibilities of its mission, its independence fortified by legislation, and its practice imbued with standards of excellence, was, for all its inevitable failures and shortcomings, an indispensable component for any truly democratic society. Thank you.